Great. So I'm here to talk to you about continuous deployment at enterprise scale. Ooh, that's a little. With Artifactory and Dcos. So I first want to ask, is anyone here familiar with Dcos? Hands? Hands? All right, I'm going to do like an introduction to it, so you guys, anyone who's not familiar with it can catch up. But just a little bit about my background. I work for Mesosphere as a developer advocate. I've been working in just generally open source communities for about 15 years, started with like Linux users groups back in the early 2000s, started contributing to projects like Debian and a few little tiny open source projects here and there, worked with Ubuntu and then into OpenStack for these past 4 years. In the past 10 years, I've been working as a Linux systems administrator, so I just became a developer advocate recently because I really liked getting into the infrastructure and system stuff, but I was like, I also like speaking at conferences. What is that job? So developer advocate it is. I also spent 4 years working on the continuous integration and deployment system for the OpenStack project. In that role, I was employed by HP to work directly on the open source project. In our CI system, we were pushing something like, at the peak, like we were running like 2,000 tests an hour across about 1,000 nodes in our infrastructure. And that was a lot of fun. So my background is mostly in CI/CD most recently. I've also worked on a couple of books, the 8th and 9th edition of the official Ubuntu book. And then I wrote a book about OpenStack last year before I joined Mesosphere and started working on Dcos. So I sort of have a confession to make. In all that time working on CI/CD with OpenStack, we didn't use Artifactory. OpenStack has an object storage, so we were sort of dogfooding that to use that, so we were using Swift for our object storage. And honestly, we were just dumping things on like an Apache directory for the rest of it. And this talk was actually submitted by someone else at Mesosphere, but he wasn't able to make it, so he transferred it to me and said, you've got a CI/CD background, you'll be perfect for this. And I'm like, I haven't used Artifactory in production. He's like, that's even better. You can show everyone how easy it is on Dcos. So here we are. So I've been working with Artifactory for a couple months now, not really in production, aside from the testing that I've been doing with the engineering team who's been working on the pulling it in. So I'm going to talk about the features that Dcos has to run Artifactory and how easy it is for someone like me to get started with it. But first, I sort of wanted to talk about this idea of separation between infrastructure and applications. When I started working as a systems administrator, we had racks of servers. My first job at my first sysadmin job was actually going into data centers and racking servers and using a disk to install Debian. So this was long, long ago. And in these cases, like we had a single server, right? You had to debug things on that single server. You had they were pets, right? So this one has funny RAM, and this one takes forever to boot up. And you had names for them, and it was this whole thing where you had specific servers. And then you run your specific applications on them. We didn't really have high availability. These were just, if the server goes down, we're all in trouble. And so in this world, infrastructure and applications were really tightly bound together because you installed your operating system, you kept that updated, and then you installed your application right there on the same piece of metal. Today, we're not doing that quite as much. Even if we have bare metal, we're distributing our workloads across them. Everyone's using load balancers and other things to create high availability. And that's sort of what Dcos does. So we create this division between infrastructure and applications. So there's the Dcos that runs a lot of the infrastructure, and then application developers focus on what they're working on. So the infrastructure admins will handle either the physical servers, or if you're deploying something on a cloud, like making sure that you've got regions distributed and making sure that all of that is working well together. And they keep those systems patched that are running the infrastructure. And then they like in our case, we're using Apache Mesos, so they'll manage that cluster as well. So that's what the infrastructure admins focus on. The application developers can then focus on running their product on top of that. So with a single click, they can scale their software. They don't have to worry about the hardware. They don't have to worry about the cluster working. They just focus on making sure that their containers are kept updated. They can do rolling updates on those. So you update your container, and then you deploy it out to the cluster slowly. And then they can also independently monitor and track just their application. Again, not worrying about the infrastructure, just what their specific application is doing. So again, here to talk about sort of how Dcos fits into this. So there's open source and enterprise versions. I am only talking about open source. Everything I run here is the open source version of Dcos, and that's what my team focuses on. I'm not even sure what the enterprise version does. I think it sets up SSL certificates and does some other security things, but there's lots of organizations using the open source version in production. So I'm not here to sell you anything. I only work on open source. But Dcos itself, it's sort of built as a way to manage your Mesos cluster. So Apache Mesos is somewhat notoriously famous for being a bit hard to manage. So one of the things we noticed at Mesosphere is a lot of our customers who were deploying Mesos were solving common problems. They were all trying to do container orchestration. They were all writing their own solutions for handling their networks. And they were doing all this like service discovery, like running their own DNS servers. And we're like, how can we help them there? Like, we want to make sure that they're not doing all this duplicative work that's not really core to their business. So that's sort of how Dcos came about. It's built on top of Mesos, and it brings a bunch of stuff together that are very common with people running large-scale installations. So it does the container orchestration. It shows you what containers are running and manages those. It handles the network between them. It shows you nice graphs of how how resources are utilized, like how much CPU is on one system, how much RAM is being used on another node. We also have task scheduling, so you can run things like with a it's like sort of like a cron job. We also have a local DNS system. It uses Mesos DNS, which allows a much easier service discovery. And I'll show you later, Artifactory has its own specific DNS name inside of a Dcos cluster automatically. Also things like unified logging and metrics, so you can track what your container is doing through the system and be alerted to things if you hook that into an alerting system. And then there's this universe catalog of pre-configured applications, one of which is Artifactory, which you can install essentially with a single click. Actually, you have to put in your license key if you're using Pro, so it's like 2 clicks. So at the core, I mentioned we're using Apache Mesos, sort of called the data center kernel. You install this across a bunch of different servers, and then they sort of act as like this one single computer. So you can access resources across that in your entire data center of everything running Mesos. On top of that, we have this thing called Marathon, which can sort of be thought of if Mesos is the kernel, Marathon is your init system. So it makes sure that everything comes up and it makes sure that everything stays running. So it restarts applications if they stop running, and it sort of just keeps an eye on everything. You don't need to pay much attention to this graph if you don't, or this little picture if you don't want to. But essentially you send tasks to it, and it starts them up, and then it checks the health of them. And we'll see later in the Dcos dashboard, you can see like health of certain applications. So that's Marathon, make sure your apps stay running. And this is sort of how Dcos looks. This is really small, so I'll just explain it. So the bottom here, it shows you can install Dcos and Mesos on pretty much anything. You can install it on bare metal, your physical servers, you can install AWS or whatever cloud platform you want to use. And then on top of that, you've got Dcos with Mesos. So you install Mesos and Dcos across all of whatever you're using as your infrastructure. So you install it on all your computers, you install it all on your cloud systems. And then on top of that, you've got the actual services and the containers that you're running. So some of the things we have, we'll talk about Jenkins and Artifactory, but we've got, Cassandra, Kafka, and all these other applications, which you'll see in the catalog. The way you interact with Dcos, sort of on a basic level, is through this web UI, which we'll explore a bit. It's come a long way. We just had our 1.9 release, and it's looking a lot crisper and brighter, which is very nice. This used to be all kind of gray. There's also a command line tool, which I'll use a little bit. You'll see me typing in some commands here and there. There's also an API that you can build against. And these are the two ways. I mean, I'd say in production, most people don't actually use the web UI very much. They just end up building things into their scripts and using the CLI tool a lot. So sort of getting into the CI/CD space. The first part of what we're going to talk about here is sort of Jenkins and Mesos. So Mesos has a Jenkins plugin, which allows Jenkins to send jobs to your Mesos cluster, just spinning up containers inside of Mesos. It makes it really easy, so you don't need to have virtual machines that you're spinning up, Jenkins just kind of automatically goes into your Mesos cluster and starts spinning up containers to launch jobs, which is really cool. It makes things a whole lot easier. Jenkins maintains that Mesos plugin, so you can find it on GitHub. I briefly mentioned Mesos DNS, and that's what gives your services names inside of your Dcos cluster so you can easily find them. Adding in Artifactory in Dcos, we've partnered with JFrog to create support for the Pro and Enterprise versions. So you will need a license key for Artifactory in order to use it on Dcos, but I'm sure you all know how to get one of those. And the Jenkins that ships in our Dcos also comes with the Artifactory plugin, so you don't need to install that. In my demo later, I won't be using the Artifactory plugin. I'm actually just using a bunch of Docker commands in the Jenkins file, but it is there by default if you want to use it. And sort of speaking to the enterprise side, on, just generally, if you're using the Artifactory Enterprise in an HA mode, you've got multiple Artifactory instances, and you've got a backend, which would be something like S3 or just a regular, you can use S3 or like an NFS share. The thing that we usually show off is just using EFS in Amazon because that's easy to mount on our Dcos nodes. And then there's a database behind that. So the Artifactory nodes talk to these, and then they go to a load balancer. What we use in Dcos is actually HA proxy based because we aren't, I think in Artifactory, it usually spits out configs for Apache and Nginx for the proxying and stuff. But we're using HA proxy because that's what we use for everything else on Dcos. So it made it really nice to integrate. I can actually show you this live because I have internet here. When you're going to configure, so I've got this Dcos system running. I'm gonna go to our universe here, packages, and these are a bunch of packages that you can install. And then we got a whole list down here, and you can search through more, so lots of stuff. But when you go to install package, if you go to advanced installation, you put your license key in here, which I'll do in a few minutes. If you're running Pro, you've got a couple of options. If you're running Enterprise, you can decide whether you're going to be using a primary or a secondary. So if you click this one, that means it's the primary that you're setting up, and that's the license key you set in the previous screen for that. Once you have your primary up, you can also set up a secondary. Now, again, as I mentioned, there is this network share that you're going to have to mount so that everyone can share the var Artifactory directory across systems. And assuming you mounted it at var Artifactory, that's just going to work if you're mounting NFS to both systems. So someone from Mesosphere actually spoke at this conference last year, and this wasn't done yet. So this is improvements that we've made in the past year to get this actually in the UI and have HA working. So it's pretty cool stuff. But I want to actually show you a demo of Artifactory and Jenkins working together on Dcos and how you set that up. So I imagine people are pretty familiar with CI/CD, but you pretty much do a git push, it sends it into your version control system, or it could be a code review system. In OpenStack, we did a code review before we actually committed the code, but even the code review system technically had git inside of it. It then goes through your CI tool. You get stuff put into Artifactory, Artifactory repo. If you're running your tests on containers, you need to have some sort of orchestration there. And then it gets pushed in, if everything passes and that's all good, it gets pushed in your production environment, which probably has a load balancer in front of it. Putting words into this of actual technologies you might use. In the example that I'm going to show you, we're pushing to GitHub. Of course, you can push to any other GitLab or whatever hosted or your hosted Git repository you're using. We're using Jenkins in this. Marathon is kind of your container manager, as I discussed. Mesos underneath that, and then we're using Marathon Load Balancer, which is what's going to actually serve up the application, which is a separate load balancer than the Artifactory one, just so we're clear. So again, the demo, it's what I'm going to show you is we're going to clone a Git repository. It's all going to happen in the background, so you won't actually see it. So that's why I'm explaining it. It's going to build a Docker container, and that is pretty much a very basic website that has some information from the Git repository to show just a very simple website. It's going to run a test on this container. It's going to run this simple link checker to make sure that all the links work. So it's just the simplest test we could think of for this demo. So nothing 404s. Once that test passes, there will be, it'll trigger Marathon, again, our scheduler, to grab the Docker image that was created. So the Docker image was sent up to Artifactory, and then Marathon's going to go grab it from the Artifactory repo registry and go ahead and install it. And then it's going to be made available so we can see it at the end of all of this. I have some prerequisites here for what I set up before I got here, because it's super boring to have you watch me install Jenkins, but it's actually just a single click. It just takes a couple minutes to launch. So Jenkins is up and running already on my system. I have a MySQL database with an empty Artifactory database. So the username and password's already been set. It's just an empty MySQL database. One of the things I actually had to manually do, since we're not using SSL certificates, is I had to tell Docker on my agent nodes in Dcos that it can run from an insecure Docker registry, and actually give it the URL or the host name inside of Dcos of what that insecure Docker registry is, which is one that's auto-generated. So what I'm going to do in this demo, I'm going to add in Artifactory Pro, and that's going to take a couple minutes. I'm going to add the load balancer that Dcos creates for Artifactory, which will let us serve up the Docker registry, because you typically need to set a proxy for that. I'll also add the SSL exception that I added on the agents to Jenkins itself, so it can push to an insecure Artifactory instance. And then you'll see and then we're going to run the actual pipeline that I just described. All right. So I'm going to come back over here to our Dcos installation. So again, I've got Jenkins and MySQL running already. I have a cheat sheet here. All right, what do I have to do here? So first, I'm going to install Artifactory. Again, you can do this from the command line, but it's a lot more fun to do it from the GUI in a presentation. So I'm just doing like the simplest thing possible. So all I'm doing is just adding a license in here. And then I'm going to go ahead and install it. And you're going to see it pop up here as deploying inside of the UI. While that's doing that, that's going to take a minute or so. So I'm going to pop over to Jenkins and add that insecure registry exception here. So I'm going to go to Configure System. And this is the Docker extra options I have to add. So I'm going to search for Mesos on here. I have to go to Advanced, and then I have to go to Advanced again. And here in Jenkins, we're going to add a parameter, env, add a value, and actually, wow, that's the key. Okay, so the value we got here is just this setting the insecure registry. And I don't know if you can see this here, but it's, here, let me just paste this into my, so this Artifactory-LB is the load balancer URL set up in DNS inside of Mesos. So this comes automatically when you install Artifactory load balancer. So you get this name that you're going to be able to reference anytime you're referencing Artifactory inside of Mesos and Dcos, which is pretty cool because then you don't need to remember that. Copy and pasting is hard today. All right. So just going to save that. We're going to go back to our interface. All right, so Artifactory is installed. That's great. We're going to install the Artifactory load balancer as well, so we can actually get to it, because Artifactory in this case is actually run on a private node. So Artifactory load balancer installs it on a public node, so it actually has a routable address. And this is kind of a big container, so it's going to take a moment to install. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right. we will wait. So again, this is Artifactory is running on a private node, Artifactory load balancer, a public node. And we'll see how this loads this up in a moment. Since our CD demo shows you a website, I actually have 2 public nodes in this Dcos cluster. Oh, I can show you the Dcos cluster. So actually, if I go to my main screen here, go to my dashboard, just sort of showing off some of Dcos. This can show you your CPU and memory and disk allocation on your node. There's also support in Dcos for GPUs now. So if I had GPUs, if I wasn't just running this on a standard Amazon cloud, that was something you'd be able to see in the dashboard as well. You can see how many tasks are running. You can see the health of things. Artifactory LB is not running quite yet. Ah, there it is. So go back to services. So now all 4 of these are running. If you go back into nodes, you also see this pretty little graph here. Again, it's showing, and here it shows you which nodes, what the nodes are actually doing. So these are the private addresses. And then it shows you how much allocation there is. And for some reason, it launched all 3 on one node. It never does that, but here we are. So everything is pretty much running on one. But if I relaunch all these services, they'll just get scattered across other ones. So we've got these services running. And now I'm going to load up Artifactory. Now, I mentioned I have 2 public agents running here, so let's kind of see if it's going to be this one. First one, first try. All right, so I'm loading up Artifactory, and it's installed, and it's served up by the load balancer. So right now, it's got no artifacts in it. So let's run a job here in Jenkins. So I have this demo Python script, so I'm going to go into my thing here. So I'm just running this pipeline script that's run by this demo.python file. This calls a Jenkins file, and it pretty much automates loading everything into Jenkins, so you don't have to watch me configuring a pipeline. And then I'm just pointing it at my AWS instance. So that's doing a bunch of stuff. That's cloning the Git repository that we're going to test. And if I go back to my dashboard here in Jenkins, we're going to see the pipeline demo coming together. Sometimes this takes a couple of minutes. So, all right, so the pipeline has started to run. So again, what this is going to do is it grab the Git repository, and it's going to go test everything on a bunch of Mesos containers using that Jenkins Mesos cluster plugin. So I didn't need to set up an extra cloud that's outside of this. It's all just running it inside the Dcos cloud that I already have. In fact, I think if you go, if you're going to go into, probably hasn't started running the jobs yet, but yeah. So Jenkins now has this task Mesos Jenkins, and that means it's like staging a container right now to run a job on. So you're going to see now Jenkins has 2 of 1 running. That means the Jenkins service itself is running, and it's also running your CI system, the container that's being tested on. So got this pretty stage view inside of Jenkins. It did the Git checkout. It's now building the Docker container that will have my little website. This is the test that it's going to do that link checker on my website. And if you're not familiar with Jenkins stage view, this is pretty cool because you can offers a nice interface to look at your logs. So I've got shell scripts, and that didn't have anything. So all the stuff that it's doing. So it's running that link checker. Hopefully this passes. If it doesn't, it's just going to run again. The test usually doesn't take this long. Okay. So finally finished the test. Publish means it's now pushing the Docker image that I created up to Artifactory. And and I told Jenkins that it's okay to push to this one here. And then the deploy step is it actually pulls down. So after it uploads to the registry, it then pulls it down from the registry and starts running it on Dcos as an additional service. So this has completed. So if we go back into Artifactory, we could look in our Docker registry. Oh, this is too small. And in the Docker registry, there is now this container that I just uploaded just a few seconds ago. And so this is the Docker container that you can now grab inside of my Artifactory. And now come on, we're not serving 0, we're serving 6 now. So that process uploaded everything pretty simply. And now if you look in here, you now have this Jenkins Deployed App. And that is the final app that was deployed at the end of this process. And I actually have this shell script spit out a link here that we can go to actually see the little website that was created running. And hey, we've got a little website that was created and is now running on Dcos, deployed from Jenkins. And again, the Docker image is hosted up in Artifactory. So the demo works, that's good news. In case it didn't, I had this pretty picture of what it's supposed to look like. But yeah, it worked. So in this case, we're not using Artifactory Enterprise. I just set up the single node. But I just sort of wanted to demonstrate how easy it is, even for someone like me who's not super familiar with Artifactory, only been working with it a couple months, to get it going and have things like automatic DNS set up, and even go as far as running like a Jenkins pipeline that not only tests and uploads, but also deploys a container into production. Right, so that was pretty much it, because the demo went much faster than I thought it would, which was great, but everything went well and it went perfectly. So I want to ask if anyone had any questions about DCS or how we're using Artifactory or. Yep. Yeah. Right, so the question is how we develop, I guess, this Artifactory plugin and Jenkins plugin things for Dcos. That is a really great question. I should have explained that. So I mentioned that we have this like this universe catalog, right? This is where we download all these packages from. These are all open source and they're managed in our Git repository for Mesosphere. Let me just grab the URL here. So it's all handled inside of our universe repository on GitHub. So there's this repository. You go into packages. If you want to look at Artifactory, go into A. So Artifactory. And so it's a series of JSON files. So anyone who is working on a project, they can upload to our general universe repository, or you can run a universe repository locally to install your own application. But these JSON files pretty much define what you saw in the dialog inside the Dcos interface. It'll show you the default number of CPUs. I'll make this a little bigger too. It'll show you, so if you think that your system needs a default of 2 CPUs and how much RAM it needs, you just define that here. So these are the defaults that pop up, again, when you go to install your package. Go to advanced installation. So you can change the number of CPUs here, but it's configured in the JSON file. So it's not trivial, but we do have documentation on how to write these JSON files and then how to upload them to the universe, or how to run your own universe catalog yourself. So again, yeah, so Artifactory 1 is all open source, and so is Jenkins. And that's where you find these. Other questions? Yep.
Can you show the Jenkins file?
The Jenkins file that I ran? Yeah. It totally has a default password in it, so, but that's okay. So it's actually in my personal branch here. So it's actually got a bit of cruft in it, but I can show you the basic parts of it that are important. So we do some Docker stuff, and then we have like the sections. So we have the checkout section, and then the build section, which pretty much just builds a Docker container using the CD demo app. It runs the test, which is just this link checker test. It then logs into, it says, pushes image to Docker Hub because I'm bad at updating comments, and I adopted this from another demo, but it actually pushes the image to Artifactory, of course. And you can again see the DNS name for our Artifactory install in here. And look, there's my password. And then in the deploy stage, again, it's calling Marathon to do the actual deployment where it downloads the Docker image from Artifactory and then deploys it as a service on Dcos. And then it just, to clean up, it kills the test container that was used to run all the tests. Yep. So Marathon is the sort of the scheduler part of Dcos. It runs on top of Apache Mesos. Oh, and Jenkins. Yeah, Marathon, is that a Jenkins plugin? It must be, yeah, because it's, let me just look at our plugins here. So let's see. Yep, so we've got, yeah, so Marathon deployment is a plugin in Jenkins that can use Marathon to deploy your application. This is open source, yes. Yep. Any other questions? Yep. So it's not so difficult. The hardest part is that on your Apache Mesos nodes, you need to mount a shared file system. So like we have some scripts that you can do it with like AWS's EFS, where it actually just runs as a service inside of Dcos, and you run that service on every single agent node, so you don't need to actually log into them with SSH. Though you can if you want. That's how I started working on them. But like this Jenkins Deployed App, you can do like a network file system mount command as a service, and then that will mount it on all your agent nodes. And then when you go to install Artifactory, as the primary and secondary, they'll all have access to that network share, and then that's how you set them up. So the hard part is getting that network share set up and mounted, but then beyond that, you know, it's just a matter of going through this interface and, you know, calling it a secondary if you want to add another one or extra ones. Yep. So which plugin am I using to attach to Mesos? It's actually just a Jenkins Mesos cluster or a plugin that Jenkins maintains, which is nice because when I was working on OpenStack, we had this whole node pool project that actually used OpenStack VMs. And so like this fleet of OpenStack VMs was living in node pool. And so we had to manage node pool and we had to make sure those VMs were all up. The really fun thing about this for me is that it's all just in Mesos. Like it's all just pulling from the same cluster of systems, which can be good and bad. But for me, it was really convenient because now everything's running together and that's like one less thing I have to manage. Anything else? All right, thank you guys.